Welcome to the Selling to Corporate podcast, where we're going to be challenging your sales beliefs around selling to corporate organizations and help you increase your bottom line profits every single month. I am Jessica Lorimer, your sales expert and guide in this world of selling to corporate companies, skyrocketing your company sales and making the impact that you really want in the world. Now, don't forget, if you do enjoy the show today, please do head over to iTunes and leave us a review. But enjoy this episode, and I am really looking forward to sharing some epic sales wisdom with you. Welcome to the hottest ever episode of the Selling to Corporate podcast. And it is warm. I am recording this in, I'm going to say, less than ideal conditions for those of you in the UK who are currently experiencing the heat wave without air conditioning. You'll know how almost impossible it is to get your brain to function in this weather. So I am sat with the worst kind of podcasting conditions, because normally when I record an episode, I've got my microphone out and I've got my nice acoustic panels and everything's set up optimally. Today it is 34 degrees. I have every single window that I possibly can open on the non-sunny side of the house. My neighbours are currently going through a building extension, and I think even my knees are sweating. So this is just to say that if this episode is shorter than normal, it is because I'm not coping well in the heat. I was born for cold weather. And for those international listeners who are thinking, why on earth don't you have aircon? The UK just wasn't built for heat. It's historically always been quite cold here, so there is no need. But I promise you that I'm looking into those portable air conditioning units as soon as humanly possible, which are now not on sale anywhere in the UK because obviously everybody's having the same idea. But needless to say that if you live in a country where air conditioning is usual and the norm, we're all very jealous of you right now. But let's dig into today's episode because it's an interesting one. And actually, it's something that I've talked about in various ways over the years, but haven't made a solo episode about. And I thought that now is the time. So one of the interesting things that I'm seeing, and I've contacted a lot of people individually over the last couple of months because I like to check in on how people are doing once they've taken a course with us. And so if you've had an email from me, if you have ever bought Cold to Closed or the C-Suite or even our self-paced programs on cold email outreach or anything like that, and over the last 6 weeks, you've had an email from me, it was really from me. So if you haven't replied to let me know how you're getting on, let me know. I'm genuinely interested. But it's interesting because I sent out lots and lots of emails and I've had lots and lots of responses from people in various stages of business talking about some of the problems that they're facing. And one of the biggest problems that is coming up consistently is lead generation. And that has been a consistent problem, I think, for most people for the entirety of this year so far. And there are so many things that have been difficult for people this year when it comes to lead generation. How to find the right leads, how to get better quality leads, how to get leads to actually book sales calls with you, how to get leads to stop ghosting you. There are so many questions that I get about lead generation. And it's interesting because in the last couple of episodes, I've also been talking about lead generation from a slightly different perspective. In fact, if you haven't listened to my previous episode that we popped out just 2 weeks ago now, why corporate buyers can't find you even when they're looking, go back and have a listen. I promise you it's an interesting one because it talks about the biggest shift in B2B sales in the last decade. And that is, of course, the rise in corporate buyers who are using AI to search for suppliers. And so here we are in July, still having similar problems with lead generation. And that cannot continue because, as we all know, especially if you've listened to the podcast for the last couple of years, September is the best time to sell to corporates, but it's the worst time if you haven't done any lead generation and don't have any qualified leads to actually sell to. Because if you don't have any leads, guess what? You don't have any sales calls and you don't have any proposals and you don't have any revenue. What you might have is a really nice offer mapped out, but that is not going to sell if you don't have leads. So what we want to make sure that you're doing is exploring all the options when it comes to lead generation, which reminds me that this episode, like every other, is sponsored by the Expert Services Directory. Incidentally, the perfect way to get passive visibility this summer and get your face and business in front of corporate decision makers with our proactive marketing that we do for all listees. So if you know you've got no time for lead generation this summer, you're fully booked, and you need proactive lead generation that's working on your behalf to get you some much needed brand visibility, brand awareness, and inbound leads, make sure you go and check it out. It's also really handy because I'm actually running a masterclass, I'm going to say next week, but it's not. It's in 2 weeks' time, on Friday the 17th of July, called Amplify with AI, which is all about how you can get found by corporate decision makers who are actively searching AI platforms like ChatGPT, Perplexity, and Claude to try and find external suppliers. And having listing in the Expert Services Directory is actually really, really helpful for that. So if you are already in the directory, congratulations, you're a step ahead of the curve. And if you are not yet and you don't fancy coming to Amplify with AI, then getting yourself a listing in the Expert Services Directory actually would be really helpful in terms of passive visibility, in terms of brand awareness, and in terms of inbound lead generation over the summer and for when those key buyers are actively looking in September. Now, if you know anything about the way that I talk about lead generation, and if you have been around here from the beginning, when I did an episode, I think it was episode 2, actually, where I talked about generating corporate leads, you will know that I have been slated royally for talking about the fact that you need to have multiple internal champions inside organizations to make your lead generation easier and to convert sales quicker. And it's interesting to me because when we talk about lead generation and when we talk about B2B sales as a whole, people who are not experienced in that space will say things like, it takes ages to sign deals in the corporate space. It takes forever to get a corporate client. Oh, it takes ages to get sign off. Deals just get put on hold all the time. Oh, you have to go through so many layers. Why bother? And I think to myself, well, that is not reflective of the experience that I have, or my clients have, or that anyone using a qualified lead generation process is having. And that's because that lead generation part is really the first piece of action that we see in the selling to corporate 5-step framework. So as a refresher, the framework that I teach you and that I teach my clients and that I teach the professional sales teams I work with is all based around clarity. Who are we selling to? What's the transformation that we're selling them? Lead generation, the process of generating qualified leads that actually book sales calls with us. Business development, that process of building, maintaining, and leveraging relationships so that they turn into revenue. Offers and proposals, so creating solutions that meet the need and articulating them in a way that gets the contract signed. And then delivery and upsell, or delivery and resell. The process of delivering a great client experience and having a sales process that follows on to maximize revenue for you and transformation for the client. Now, the interesting thing about this process, that clarity is right at the beginning, but clarity is not necessarily an action point. It is a decision point, right? And that's interesting because the rest of the steps are all things that we practically do, that we practically take action on. Lead generation is the first part of that. And lead generation is also the first point of quality control in your sales process. And people always forget this. And that's why I get lots of messages. And if you sent me one, don't worry, this isn't about any particular person, but if you've sent me something that says, how can I get better leads? The question you should be asking yourself is, how can I set my lead generation process up so that I am qualifying early, right? So let's remind ourselves what a qualified lead looks like. A qualified lead, simply in the corporate space, is a decision maker who A, is responsible for your area of specialism, and B, has authority over the budget to pay you. That's really, really important. Anyone else is and can be useful to your sales process, but they are not a decision maker. Now, sometimes that stings, and I've had emails from people recently who've said to me, oh, I don't like the way that you talk about lead generation because it makes me think that a lot of the calls that I'm having, the sales calls I'm having, are actually networking calls or connection calls or whatever else you want to call them. And I get that. And I get that relationship building is key. Believe me, I'm a big relationship builder. And as I mentioned earlier in this episode, I've reached out to loads of previous clients recently to see how they're getting on because I like to know. I like to check in. I care. But wasting your time on sales calls with people who aren't decision makers, that's not something I'm a fan of. It's a big waste of time. Your time. And your time is really valuable. So what we have to start doing is making sure that our lead generation process right from the beginning is set up to succeed. And that means talking to the right people at the right time. That's as simple as lead generation gets. Now, if you have listened to the podcast for a while, you'll know that I talk about this idea of multiple internal champions. And you might be thinking, well, hang on a second, Jess, because there's only going to be one person who is responsible for my area of specialism and has authority over the budget to pay me. And to that, I say, oh, no, my friend. That's not necessarily the case. So if you think about some of the things that we come across in the B2B sales process, or some of the, not objections, but challenges people often have or face when it is that they start selling B2B, we have things like, oh, the decision-making process takes ages. Well, it doesn't really, unless you're talking to the wrong people in the first place. If you're talking to a bunch of people who are too junior or who don't understand what you do, or to whom what you do isn't actually relevant commercially, then yeah, your decision-making process is going to take ages because you and your services aren't relevant and they can't see how they're useful to them, right? Kind of like when somebody messages on LinkedIn and says, I don't know, I get it all the time. People who'll say, oh, I've recorded this webinar on learning how to be a web designer. Do you want it? And I'm like, oh, no thanks. Anyone who's ever gone on Wayback and seen my first ever website will know that a particularly unattractive shade of brown is not, in fact, what you want for a branding exercise, and probably doesn't qualify me as somebody who's ever going to make waves in the website design world. But what we don't like about those approaches is not that people bother to approach us. It's the fact that they're not relevant. And so for some of the people that I talk to every week and month and, all that kind of thing, I hear a lot, oh, well, the decision process, it just takes ages. That's why I'm not selling more to corporate, or why I'm not selling consistently to corporate, or why all the deals that I've tried to do have been put off or gone slower. It starts with lead generation. Did you generate the right lead in the first place? Or actually, did you spend a load of time trying to get an introduction to the right lead? Or did you talk to somebody who was too junior, who had to sell you in, who didn't actually have enough influence internally to do that? So they've put you on the back burner and then ghosted you. These things happen, but if you know about it, you can avoid it. We also have to think about the bigger the deal, the more decision makers who are involved. If a company is spending £40,000 or $100,000 on something, and I talk about this not as extravagant numbers, these are deal sizes that are being done by my clients every single quarter. right? So they're not unusual. But if a company is spending that much money, do you honestly think that they're going to have one person who's like, yeah, cool, I'll wear that. I'll wear that decision, good or bad? No, obviously not. It's the same as in your business. If you were going to spend £100,000 on an investment in your business, I bet you'd ask your partner about it. I bet you'd ask if you are working with a finance director or advisor. I bet you'd ask them about it. I bet you'd ask your friends about it or your peers in the business world. Because it's a huge amount of money on the line, and it's also a large amount of transformation on the line. The impact could be huge, but it needs sense checking, right? So the bigger the deal, yeah, of course, the more layers that tend to be sense checked around it. And that means that there may be more decision makers who are involved. That's normal. If you don't know them, and if they don't know you, then it's going to be tough for other decision makers outside of the one that you've originally talked to be able to say yes confidently. And at that point, that's where they start going and researching themselves, right? So let's say that you have a really good contact in the form of an HR director, but actually it's a bigger deal and they have to get the COO and the head of procurement to also agree it. If they don't know you and they see just your proposal, well, yeah, great. I'm sure it articulates everything that you're going to do, and hopefully it does it really well. But if they don't know you and they haven't been part of the sales process, 100% they are going to go and research the best other leadership coach, talent development expert, health and wellness supplier. Like they're just going to because it's normal. And if they can't find you, that's also a problem. And that's why, a couple of weeks ago when I talked about the why corporate buyers can't find you and, why that's a problem episode, that's why working on both your proactive and your passive lead generation is so important. Because if you start having conversations with single points of contact inside organizations, and you are not also making the time to build relationships with multiple internal champions, other decision makers who will find what you do relevant commercially to them and who are in part of the decision making chain or process around it, you're going to find it harder to sell bigger deals. And to be clear, I'm not talking about things under £15,000. Like that, you can probably get single sign off relatively easily for it, particularly if you've got a decision maker who is confident, who has their own budget allocated, and that you've run a really good sales process with and demonstrated clear commercial viability to. But if you're looking over that amount, then of course you are moving into bigger deals, bigger areas of transformation, usually transformations that are going to impact not just one team, but multiple. And so that means that you have to get multiple people on board to build relationships with. The other interesting thing that we face is that people say, oh, well, I talk to people in companies, but they all just leave because they're miserable. And yeah, do you know what? People leave jobs all the time. I would wager that there's not a person who listens to this podcast that hasn't even thought about quitting their business at some point. Like, it happens. In the world of employment, people have other opportunities. They have the opportunity to go and generate a higher salary elsewhere. They have the opportunity to go somewhere where they might get additional benefits they want. They might have the opportunity to go somewhere where they're going to get a better work-life balance. It doesn't matter why they're going, but it does matter that they're leaving. Because if you've had one or more sales calls with a point of contact and they leave, well, one, the likelihood of them telling you that they're going to leave is quite slim, unless they feel like they have a good relationship with you. And two, if they leave, and you haven't got a sales process signed off, and you don't have other people in the organization that you build relationships with, well, guess what? Your sales process just went back to zero because they left. So any work that they did on your behalf, any influence they tried to create on your behalf, that is really limited now. Because people in the organization will see it as they left them in a bit of a bind, right? I would also guess that everybody who listens to this podcast at some point has had a job and left a job and has realized that, organizations find it's easier to actually keep somebody, to pay them a little bit more, even though they've refused them pay rises for years. Because when they decide to leave, it's really inconvenient. It's not that they suddenly go, oh, wow, we value that person so much more. It's just like, actually, it'd be really inconvenient if you left. So now we'll give you the pay rise and everything you want. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, particularly if they have a good recruiter behind them, those people will still leave. I used to advise my candidates when I was working in recruitment, at the point you start looking for a job, you are ready to leave. And it doesn't really matter what your employer does to buy you back. That problem will always continue to exist. So if the problem was, oh, they're not paying me enough, and you've asked them for pay rises repeatedly for, 2 years, yeah, okay, they're going to offer you some more money not to leave, not to have the inconvenience. But the other issues that you had with them will still exist, and they're still going to avoid giving you pay rises when you ask until you threaten to leave again, and the cycle continues. So the point being for you that employees in jobs will always leave. Your key decision makers will move on. They will go to other organizations that feel like a better fit for them at the time. And if you don't have multiple internal champions at an organization, you're going to find it harder to navigate that situation. You're going to find that your sales processes stall, go back to zero, and are much more difficult to be picked up. This is why multiple internal champions matter, and having multiple internal champions matter. The heat is making me skip my words. I'm sorry. But it's when we talk about what an internal champion is, we're talking about other decision makers who are relevant to your area of specialism and who would also feel the impact of the work that you do. Now, that doesn't mean that they will necessarily be in control of a budget. It doesn't mean that they will necessarily be part of the sales process, but it means that they will be invested and that they would be useful to you either during the sales process as somebody who could understand and support the internal selling of an idea, or somebody who would be useful if something went wrong in the sales or delivery process. Let's say your main point of contact was sick. Would you have anybody else that you could follow up with and chase a proposal with? Let's say your main point of contact leaves before you've managed to put your invoice in. Would you have somebody that you could contact and say, hey, look, who is it that I talk to in finance now? What we're talking about with multiple internal champions is building relationships with 3 to 5 people in each organization that can be useful during both your sales and your delivery process. And that's really, really important because each of these people will A, be really great relationships for you to build, but B, they'll have different views of the organization, different views of the priorities that are in place, different views of what the company wants to spend money on, and potentially different budget pots that they can contribute as well, meaning that you can sell at more premium levels by encouraging shared budget and things like that. So this isn't a nice to have. This is integral if you want to be able to sell bigger deals like retainers, like licensed content, like big speaking fees and things like that in a simpler way. You need to work on your lead generation process, and that means understanding who to target as your main decision maker, that person who has responsibility for your area of specialism and who has control over the budget to pay you. But you also need to be identifying the multiple internal stakeholders or decision makers who would be useful to you during that sales process or during the delivery process. because that's going to help you build a much stronger relationship with the organization, give you a much better assessment of where the organization actually is on key topics that you're responsible for, and also a much better maintenance of that relationship with the organization in case people leave, are sick, or ghost you for whatever reason. Now, everything that I've talked about today is how you win over companies internally once you're in the running, right? That means once you've done the proactive outreach to get the sales call, to identify the opportunity to move forward with it. That cannot happen unless you do lead generation, right? Unless you are part of the shortlist for the sales process in the first place. And we forget this because I think we spend far too much time thinking about what we're going to sell when we're in an organization or when we're on the phone, and not enough time actually booking sales conversations with the right decision makers in the first place. So if that has been you in the first half of the year and you've spent a lot of time planning out your offers, pricing your offers, thinking about what you're going to do, posting on LinkedIn, all that kind of stuff, that's fine. But I don't think it will have produced the results that you've wanted in the first half. And that means that in the second half of the year, you have to be supremely focused on both proactive and passive lead generation strategies so that you are booking those steady sales calls and being in front of decision makers before that September rush. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how nice your offer is. They're never going to see it. They're never going to find it. They're never going to experience the transformation. Okay. So make sure that you are working on both your proactive lead generation, meaning cold email outreach or LinkedIn outreach, however you want to work it, but also make sure that you're working on that passive lead generation. And if you do need support with either of those things, remember you can message me on LinkedIn or you can drop me an email. And I can recommend resources, other podcast episodes, other resources that we have that can help you to nail both proactive outreach and passive lead generation as well. Because in this particular time for B2B sales, you are going to need both. You are going to need proactive outreach that puts you actively in front of decision makers in their inbox with something that is targeted, that is relevant, that they want right now. And you're also going to need that passive lead generation piece because decision makers are researching on their own, and more they're using ChatGPT, Claude, Perplexity. They're typing in, find me a leadership consultant in financial services, and they're getting a shortlist back in seconds. And if your name is not there, then even with proactive outreach, your one single internal champion is walking into a room full of people who say, okay, great, they sound good, but have we searched for anybody else? And they're having to do a much bigger sales job for you. Okay. So make sure if you haven't got a proactive lead generation strategy in place yet, that you do so over the summer. And like I say, you're more than welcome to drop me a message on LinkedIn or drop me an email and I can recommend other resources. And you must get that passive lead generation piece sorted. And if you're interested in learning exactly how I've been working with professional sales teams to achieve that over the last 12 months, then make sure you get yourself signed up to Amplify with AI on the 17th of July. Unintentional rhyme. I'll pop the link in the show notes for you, and you can obviously use code podcast to get yourself a bit of a deal. All right, I'll see you in the next episode.